Richard Lee McNair is one of America's all-time greatest prison escape artists. His daring 2006 escape from the intimidating Federal Correction Complex just south of Pollock, Louisiana, was the first from a high-security federal prison in 13 years, and there hasn't been one since. The foreword of a book written about McNair's exploits stated that he was the only man ever to have broken out of a local jail, a state penitentiary, and a federal penitentiary. So what was it that made this man so hard to keep locked up, and just how did he pull off his daring escapes? Originally jailed for murder in 1988, McNair has been referred to as a double murderer and a textbook unsavoury character. This view is questionable, however, when making a closer study of his personality and behaviour. Things such as this are rarely as black and white as they seem on the surface, and the man has even been hailed as a folk hero of sorts, for his consistent defiance of authority and apparent adherence to a personal moral code, having never robbed a person or a home despite the time he spent on the run totalling some years. The crime that put Nair in prison to begin with was not his first, but it was by far the most serious he ever committed. He'd been attempting to burgle an agricultural facility in North Dakota, nearby to his station at Minot Air Force Base, where he was a sergeant. It's unclear why a professional military man would want to commit an act of burglary. It would appear in McNair's case that he had a history of petty crime, and perhaps that compulsion still continued despite paradoxically choosing a career of order and discipline. Disturbed from his intended plan during the heist by two men, the 29-year-old McNair fired his gun, killing one and seriously wounding the other, who ultimately survived. So he was never a double murderer, as some have stated. When he was brought in for questioning by police, it seems he admitted to the act, handing over the weapon used without protest. Richard McNair was initially held in custody at the local police station in Minot. Not much is known about his first successful attempt at ditching his captors, other than that it happened very soon after his being brought in. Unfortunately for McNair, his initial escape didn't last more than a few hours, and he soon found himself back in a jail cell, this time handcuffed to a chair with 3 detectives patrolling the corridors nearby and checking in on him. Undeterred, the resourceful Houdini managed to pull a lip balm, that's a chapstick for American viewers, out of his pocket and used it to lubricate his wrists so that he could squeeze his hands free. Back on the street with Minot's finest in hot pursuit, McNair found himself on the rooftop of a 3-story building. Determined not to surrender and thinking fast, he leapt from the roof into a nearby tree. The branches broke, dumping the fugitive unceremoniously to the ground, where he was incapacitated and easily apprehended once more by the police. After a short stay in hospital, where he was no doubt cuffed to the bed and not allowed any lip balm, McNair was moved to the much more secure Ward County Jail. In February of 1988, after only a very brief stay, it was discovered that he'd been working away at the mortar between the concrete breeze blocks which comprised his cell wall. Apparently he'd already managed to get 2 of them loose without anyone noticing, and had hidden a bedsheet behind them. Eventually McNair would be sentenced to 2 life sentences for murder and for attempted murder, and another 30 years for attempted robbery. The next chapter in McNair's story is how he prison hopped his way across the United States, although this time not by actually breaking out. It seems that he would assess each facility for weak points, and if there were none to be found, he'd find other means to engineer his transfer somewhere else. Richard McNair was initially jailed at the North Dakota State Penitentiary in Bismarck. He adapted himself to prison life for the first 3 years, no doubt with its similarities to Air Force Base life, until in October of 1992 he would attempt and succeed in his first escape from a state-level facility. Accompanied by 2 fellow inmates, McNair crawled through one of the prison building's ventilation systems, beginning in one of the education rooms where the reformed McNair was involved in crime prevention programs for local teenagers. The air duct opened out onto a rooftop which the men traversed, dropping into a vehicle parking area. The duration of successfully avoiding recapture for each of the escaped inmates was respectively several hours for the first, several days for the second, and a total of 10 months for McNair himself. Richard McNair was necessarily a master of disguise, growing out and dyeing his hair blonde, growing a moustache or beard, changing his appearance any way he could to avoid recapture. He was captured continually on CCTV cameras in gas stations and convenience stores, but never identified until later when investigators would piece together his journey across the country. In July of 1993, McNair would finally be rearrested in Grand Island, Nebraska, some 500 miles south of the facility he had broken out of after attempting to break into a car dealership. Realising they had a real problem case on their hands and relieved to have back their latest and most embarrassing escapee, North Dakota Department of Corrections arranged to have him moved one state east to Minnesota's Oak Park Heights Correctional Facility, a level 5 maximum security prison. McNair spent several years here, and it said he eventually realised he wouldn't be able to break out. Perhaps that's where the system should have left him to pay off his debt to society, but McNair had other plans. He participated in the sit-down protest at the prison, which saw him removed from Oak Park Heights all the way to Florence High State Prison in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Colombia. Again, he realised that escape would be unlikely at this location, and so he arranged for a transfer to United States Penitentiary Pollock, 1,000 miles away to the southeast in Louisiana. Likely due to his good behaviour, despite the obvious jailbreak from the penitentiary in Bismarck and participation in the sit-down protest in Minnesota, McNair's request was approved. Maximum Security USP Pollock would be the scene of McNair's greatest escape, and probably one of the most daring prison escapes ever undertaken. Although he was a known prison break artist and would no doubt have been watched extra closely by Pollock's guards for the first part of his stay, McNair is said to have been different to most typical prisoners. He looked more like an outdoor pursuits enthusiast than a hardened career convict. He was well spoken, didn't smoke or drink, he had no piercings or tattoos. He kept in shape at the prison gym and was often seen running in the yard. Richard McNair woke up at approximately 6 a.m, went for a jog, and then headed to the canteen of his cell block for breakfast, his typical routine. Just after 7 a.m, he was in his designated work area, where his present daily task was the sorting of old mail sacks. Now, McNair had been planning his escape since the mailbag sorting job had come around. The bags, which couldn't immediately be repaired and reused, were being loaded onto forklift pallets and shrink-wrapped before being taken for storage in another part of the prison complex. What he learned next, completely by chance, was the thing that sparked McNair's determination to make his move soon. The assistant factory manager was mouthing off about needing the bags to be moved ASAP, and that inferred that they wouldn't be staying overnight in a staging area that would probably be locked, but instead moved directly to a warehouse outside the prison perimeter. McNair knew he hadn't long to act, a week at most, but his window of opportunity had arrived. This is the thing about someone like Richard McNair. He was well prepared and resourceful, but also an opportunist. He was continually reading books in the prison library about outdoor skills and bushcraft, and subscribed to several magazines too. He was caching supplies in his work area for his breakout long before he even heard about the pallets destined for the warehouse. The first thing he had to do was make sure he could work alone, to avoid arousing the suspicion of fellow inmates. This was achieved by the magic combination of making himself difficult to work with, and the fortuitous bonus offered at that time for men who went to work in new mailbag assembly. Within a few days, McNair was working alone. He had to be bold again, and lucky, because there were CCTV cameras everywhere. In his own words, you'd have been amazed at how open the area was. He built a frame from metal tubes secured with zip ties, placed it onto a pallet, and buried it in mail bags before shrink-wrapping the whole thing. He placed some of his supplies inside, and the most critical ones he taped to his body beneath his clothing, so that if he had to make a run for it, he'd have those at least. The last part of his plan was to report the readiness of the pallets to the other workers, and that the supervisor wanted them on the next delivery. He was on his way to medical, he told them. Doubling back to his work area without being seen, McNair stowed himself inside the cramped escape pod, sealing the entry hole with a piece of cardboard he'd covered with a mail sack to look just like part of the pile. His legs were drawn up against his chest in a fetal position. His arms were tightly pressed around the sides of his body, and his chin was resting on his knees. He breathed through a cardboard snorkel which went down and out the bottom of the pallet. This is how he would spend the next few crucial hours. After the fact, McNair recounted the tale to Canadian journalist and author Byron Christopher and described the feeling the moment his pallet was lifted from the warehouse floor for the first time. It was exciting as hell. The adrenaline rush was so intense. Everything slowed down and my senses went into overdrive. Despite the initial excitement, things were off to a slow start, as the warehouse worker responsible for moving his pallet didn't seem in any particular hurry. She left him on the loading dock outside in the hot Louisiana sunshine for what must have seemed like an eternity. Entombed within the shrink-wrapped pallet of dusty old sacks, McNair's ordeal heightened. He said to Christopher, "The inside of the pod felt like a furnace. Sweat rolled off me. My head was swimming in the fog. I was afraid I would pass out. My fears, every noise amplified." He thought back to his military training. Distract the mind from the situation, yet remain focused on the mission. The mission was freedom, and that freedom was close at hand. The distinctive clatter of an automated gate sliding aside told Richard McNair that he had reached the perimeter fence. There were 2 of these gates to pass through, and in between the final and most scrutinous guard. In a maximum security prison, as you might expect, everything is treated with suspicion, especially goods out. McNair heard the sound of the second automated gate rolling aside, but with no way to see out. For all he knew, he was heading back inside to be locked in a trailer awaiting closer inspection. Perhaps due to the rush put on the work by the impatient supervisor, or some other reason, he was soon moving again, and in the right direction. McNair recounted that the first thing which told him he was outside as opposed to back inside was the sound of a nearby vehicle horn. Vehicles were an extremely rare sight inside the perimeter fence of a maximum security prison. He was on his way to the storage warehouse outside the fence, albeit still on prison grounds. Soon his pallet came to rest, and the noises outside diminished. He knew he was on short time, however, as there were several scheduled head counts in the prison each day, with occasional random counts. If one of these counts took place and a prisoner was found absent, the whole place would be on high alert until that man was located, especially if that man were a renowned prison break artist. Cutting his way out of his hiding place, he was delighted to find himself in an open warehouse. No locked doors, nothing. He calmly began walking southwards, deliberate in his decision not to run for obvious reasons. McNair told Christian, "The senses are so acute, no way to describe it. Everything is magnified, smell, vision, hearing. It's as if you can sense with the skin." He had made the transition from prisoner to fugitive. Soon he made it to the relative safety of a wooded area, but he still had to make his way around a large construction site where a new medium security prison wing was to be. He was delayed several times by idling construction workers, fearing that the slightest movement might give the game away. Once past the danger, he dropped to his hands and knees and crawled about through the undergrowth in a rough figure-of-8 pattern. This was a well-known technique for thwarting the hounds the prison staff might well deploy to track down an escapee. He also made a couple of laps of a small nearby pond. This guy wasn't messing about. The deception complete, Richard McNair emerged from the trees at the east-west running Airbase Road. The end of prison property and the beginning of public. He recalled seeing a water tower with the word Pollock written on the side some distance to his left, and it's easy to spot this tower on Google Maps today to get an idea of exactly where his route crossed the main road. On the other side of the road, he climbed over a small wire fence, but as he did so, a passing motorist glanced his way. It was almost certain she would report something like this so close to a maximum security prison. What bad fortune. He was half a mile distant now from the nearest prison guard tower, and once again in the relative safety of the trees. The next obstacle in his way was a 10-foot-high deer fence skirting the perimeter of a hunting reserve. He followed the fence west without attempting to climb it. He had carefully pored over maps of the local area whilst planning his escape, and he probably knew that the game reserve on the other side would be relatively wild country, and possibly difficult to traverse on foot. Instead, by heading west, he would intersect with the north-south running railroad, which would allow him to make great time with minimal chance of being spotted again. Still with no idea if the motorist had reported him, or if his absence had been noticed back at the prison, McNair made his way south along the railroad in the direction of Alexandria, a sizable city. There are several points where minor roads intersect the rails, and it was at one of these he hit a sizable snag. Police officer Carl Bordelon. The officer had, by sheer chance, been driving across the railroad crossing as McNair approached, running along the tracks. Prison staff had alerted police that they'd lost a prisoner earlier that day, but they also stressed they weren't certain that he'd left the premises. It's highly likely they thought this impossible, and much more likely that he was just hiding within the prison somewhere. They had provided a description and an old photograph which Bordelon later said had looked nothing like the man he briefly apprehended. Their interaction was captured on Bordelon's patrol car's dashcam and is available to view in full on YouTube, link in the description box below. The exchange lasted 10 minutes. Bordelon asks McNair, "Do you live around here? And do you have any ID on you? And what's your name?" McNair, thinking fast, remembers the name of one of the suburbs of Alexandria, Pineville, and says that's where he's staying. He gives a false name, Robert Jones, and then asks, "Was I not supposed to be on the tracks?" McNair still doesn't know for a fact that the authorities are onto him yet, but he knows it's possible. Bordelon responds, "That's not the problem right now," and continues to try to pin down McNair, or Robert Jones, to an address. McNair spins a tale that he's from out of town, helping his brother with some roofing work. He swigs from his small bottle of water, which no doubt bolsters the illusion he's just out for some exercise. Bordelon smokes a cigarette. At this point, the officer lets McNair know there's been a report of an escapee from the local prison. McNair looks away suddenly, possibly a subconscious gesture to conceal his alarm, then turns back and exclaims, "There's a prison here?" One can imagine the adrenaline coursing through his system as he attempts to get through the officer's questions convincingly. The next few minutes, Bordelon is on the radio trying to get a better description of the man he is looking for, while McNair acts nonchalant. Bordelon and the woman on the other end of the radio talk about how bad the photograph of McNair they have been given by the prison is, no doubt giving his confidence a boost. Finishing his radio call, the cop says to McNair, "You know the bad thing? You're matching up to him." No doubt a gut-wrenching moment. Again, McNair turns away suddenly before coming back with a jokey answer. "Well, that sucks, doesn't it?" The cop presses the escapee for more information about his brother and where he's staying. McNair falters at this point, trying to divert the conversation away from things which require specific answers which could be confirmed or denied factually. Another gut-wrenching moment for McNair. The cop looks down at his filthy white shorts and his scuffed up legs. "Did you go through a briar patch or something?" Of course, we know the correct answer is yes, but McNair says he prefers to do roofing work in shorts as opposed to long trousers, and knee pads are too hot. Indeed, the thermometer reading on the dashcam footage says 113 Fahrenheit. That's 45 Celsius for European viewers. Perfect conditions for a 12-mile jog after a day of working on a rooftop. It's incredible Bordelon doesn't bust him at this point, and then the cherry on the top? He asks his name a second time, and without missing a beat, McNair gives a different forename. Now he's Jimmy Jones. McNair makes small talk until Bordelon starts to feel like he's wasting his own time. Hands on hips, looking down at the ground as the internal battle of self-doubt wages on. The escapee says jokingly, "I promise you, I'm not no damn prison escapee." Bordelon replies, "You'd have done run by now. You know that yourself." Another 2 minutes of small talk, and Richard McNair is on his way once more, running down the rail tracks, whilst Carl Bordelon heads back to his car. McNair later described his feeling of disbelief and bewilderment at having successfully bamboozled his would-be captor. 2 weeks later, McNair crossed the border into British Columbia, the westernmost province of Canada. Despite several close calls with law enforcement and no fewer than 12 appearances on TV's America's Most Wanted, he would stay on the run for the next 19 months, continually changing his appearance, faking documents, and monitoring any media coverage of himself to stay one step ahead. He stole vehicles and cash from car dealerships to keep things moving along. Inevitably, his extended flight came to an end on October 24, 2007, when he was recaptured by 2 Canadian police officers one of whom was a 6-week rookie. McNair said of the event, "It was just one of those days." After extradition to the United States, the now legendary Prison Break artist was sent to ADX Florence, the so-called Alcatraz of the Rockies, where he remains to this day. If you've enjoyed this story, hit the subscribe button and the bell to stay up to date with Mystery Realm. Also check out the links to some of our other videos in the end screen. Thanks for watching.